Kia ora tātou katoa. Jesus and the groups that after his death carried on his message had a backdrop in common. The colonization of the physical, mental and spiritual space by Rome. Rome dominated their lives. Roman ways, Roman soldiers, Roman taxes and Roman imperial theology. And with that colonization came much death and much suffering. This backdrop determines how we understand Jesus and the Jesus movements. So when we read of a young Mary singing the hope that the Almighty would be cast down from their thrones, we need to hear it as sedition. When a Jesus reads an Isaiah piece from 500 years earlier about letting the oppressed go free, we need to hear it as sedition. When a Paul, using a baptismal formula, talks about slaves and free, men and women being all one, namely equal in power and status, we need to hear it as sedition. Mary, Jesus and Paul, all using texts that others had written, were pushing back against colonization. For Rome was built on hierarchies of power in race, class and gender. It was built on obedience and the punishment of those who dissented. And it was built on a theology of the emperor as a god ordaining all the actions of Rome as providential, natural and blessed. The Jesus movements, as they grew and spread across the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, were movements of resistance to Roman colonization. Beginning at the meal table, beginning in the mind and heart, beginning in how they saw themselves, how they saw their neighbours, and how they saw the nature of God. They did not follow the ways of some who resisted with violence. Instead, they resisted by enacting a big idea, a dream of oneness, of all humanity being one kin, one body, connected, important, and fundamentally equal under God. My point is simply to overlook the backdrop of Roman colonization is to miss the meaning of much of the theology and practice of what would become Christianity. We were born in a context of colonization as a resistance movement. Last Tuesday, I wrote a piece on the vexed issue of closing of some 48 backcountry huts in Te Whiti. For many hunters, trampers and conservationists, Pākehā and Māori, those huts hold promises of, they hold memories and promises of more memories. And so there have been protests, media, correspondence and kōrero between Te Uru, Tom Atua, that's the board mandated to care for Te Whiti, and the concerned parties. This talk has included issues of governance, consultation, conservation, ownership and belonging. What hasn't featured in the media and what my piece was pointing out was the backdrop of colonization and its consequences. In 1865, the Crown confiscated much of Tūhoe's productive land, even though the tribe were not in rebellion against the Crown. In 1870, Tūhoe were forced out of Te Whiti, leading to widespread starvation and extensive loss of life. In 1954, the Crown established Te Whiti National Park, which included most of Tūhoe's traditional lands. The Crown had stolen Tūhoe's land. And for 144 years it was so. The tangata whenua, the nation of Tūhoe, were kept from their land, their blood whenua, and their responsibilities to guard and care for Te Uruwera. Then in 2014 the Crown began a process of righting this wrong, with the return of Te Uruwera, an apology, and a commitment to help resource its future well-being. My point in what I wrote was simply, to understand today we cannot forget the history of yesterday. Present-day differences have a backdrop. In the case of Tūhoe, it's a backdrop of dispossession and deprivation caused by colonization. What I didn't say in my article was that the connection of the Presbyterian Church of Aotearoa New Zealand with Te Ao Māori, the Māori worldview, is largely through our connection with Tūhoe. We have a long history together, which begs the question, is our relationship one of charity, that is, financial assistance and resourcing, or one of justice, redressing wrongs and empowering a future that is decolonized? It's worth thinking about that word, decolonization. It's a word that can be used to describe the move to self-governance. It's a word that describes trying to undo the wrongs of the past. It involves acknowledgement, restitution, and restoration. It's a word that involves, for those of us who've inherited from Aotearoa's settler times, what can be called Pākehā privilege, a journey of change and healing, opening ourselves to difference, and the need to not just share, but to reconfigure the ideologies and structures that dominate the political, economic, and social relationships in this land. Using a computer metaphor, it's not just about uploading a new program. It's about developing a whole new operating system. That we still have a way to go in this journey is evident in many ways. I post my Tuesday pieces on Facebook where some 1,200 people, also known as friends, can access it. But actually it goes far wider than that. This time, someone, somewhere, somehow passed it to members of Ngāi Tūhoe, and I have been touched by their affirming responses. Soberingly, the acknowledgement of the theft of the land and the spiritual destruction that the theft brought are seemingly seldom acknowledged by Pākehā. Which is why Parihaka, some 520 kilometres away on the other side of Te Ika ao Māori, Te Ika ao Maui is the North Island. That's why Parihaka is important. Simply as been the logic of saints' days for centuries, simply we need reminders. In the 1870s, the Parihaka settlement in Taranaki became a focal point for Māoris seeking a different way to respond to new Pākehā settlers who were taking land through dodgy deals, false promises, and force. Resisting that violence with violence in return wasn't achieving justice. So under the leadership of Te Whiti o Rongomai and Tohu Kākahi, a decision was taken to put aside practices of vengeance and revenge and resist the land confiscations and loss of control over their lives with non-violent means. Instead of fighting the soldiers and surveyors who were preparing confiscated lands for sale, the people of Parihaka sent out ploughmen to cultivate the land and workers to build fences. The first ploughmen were arrested, but offered no resistance. Others came to take their place. They too were arrested. More took their place. Parliament passed special laws to enable the ploughmen of Parihaka to be imprisoned without charge. Yes, this happened in New Zealand. No trials were held. Some of those arrested ploughmen were sent as political prisoners to Dunedin and forced to work on the construction of roads. Then on the 5th of November 1881, Te Rā o Te Pahua, the day of plunder, government troops invaded the settlement of Parihaka with an overwhelming show of force to arrest its leaders and many of its men. The soldiers were met by singing, dancing, and the handing out of bread. 500 loaves had been specially made. But the invaders burnt homes and crops. They destroyed livestock, imprisoned the leaders, and raped women. This is the story of Parihaka. Remember, remember, the 5th of November. And then in 2017, the process of righting this wrong took a big step forward, with the Crown offering an apology, a significant financial reparation, and a commitment to Parihaka's future well-being. There was acknowledgement, restitution, and steps towards restoration. This too is part of the Parihaka story. The early Jesus groups were movements of resistance against the colonization, not just of land, but of the body and mind. And they developed an alternate understanding of God, an understanding that was already within their ancient writings. And they embodied it. Their God was holy. They too, their bodies and minds were holy. Thus too were other people's bodies and minds. God was not up and over, but here and within. The hierarchies and the colonist mindset was built on was not holy, but was heresy. And so our faith forebears dreamed of a different reality, grounded in justice and the work to make it come about. And the forces of colonization and its pervasive ways were unfortunately not easily vanquished. The radical, subversive agenda was watered down as the centuries went on. Mary was transformed from a prophetic solo mum to a compliant supporter of men in power. Paul's aversion to slavery was refuted by other later letters allegedly to be from him. Jesus' words about liberation were diluted to admonitions to generously give alms, rather than upset the structural hierarchies that dominated the political and social landscapes. My point is simply we need to remember our roots in colonization, our roots in resistance, how they have compromised us, how they've shaped us, and how we can, on this journey of acknowledgement, restitution and restoration, to do better. For the journey is far from over. Blessings to you.